Welcome home, Roger, was the message from Cleveland Golf when Roger Cleveland rejoined the company. We now have the pleasure of sitting down with Roger Cleveland to talk about his past, the present, and possibly even the company's future. I guess if we can go all the way back, how did you get into golf originally?
I had some friends, I was about 12, and I had some friends that wandered off on the weekend and their parents played. My parents didn't. And I said, where are you guys going? And they said, well, we're going to Lakewood Golf Club in Long Beach. And I said, well, let me go with you one day. And so I did. And I got some clubs from a sporting goods store. And I got hooked.
Yeah.
Really quick. And I was fortunate enough to have a great teacher. John Anselmo was a teacher, and he was teaching later on another guy by the name of Woods, Tiger.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, he also was teaching Scotty Cameron when
Wow.
he moved from Long Beach down to the Huntington Beach area. So it was kind of interesting.
And you played at USC.
Yes.
In college.
Yes, I got a scholarship, but I played a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Was there ever a time where you thought maybe you could go beyond college? Were you that good?
Well, you always think you might be that good. So I did that. I tried. After college, I went into business at McDonnell Douglas, and I played golf with some of the executives there, and they said, come on. So they gave me a training program, and it was fun. I loved the aerospace, but I wanted to try it. So the pro at Virginia Country Club said I'd know somebody, and he was one of the Claude Harmon people at Wingfoot. So I went back to New York.
Wow.
And as an assistant, and worked for a couple of years, and tried it at that time, and almost made the U.S. Open. Went to the final. Made the first cut, or the 36-hole qualifier, and then went to the second and just missed it. And I said, enough.
Is that when you parlayed into club manufacturing, club making, or when did that really start?
I started collecting old clubs.
Okay.
And so the history of golf, I always loved the history. And so that's when I started, because New York, there's a lot of that's where New York and Chicago are the two areas where golf began in the United States. And so there's a lot of old clubs around there, and it was fun.
Yeah.
It was really fun to go out and look at, old stores and so forth where I could find them.
Well, collecting and making,
yes,
two different things.
Different things, but you learn from the history.
Sure.
And so I learned from, I was a classic guy in college, and I love the woods, the classic woods that were made, especially by McGregor, and so that really influenced me. And the irons, there were some beautiful irons made by several companies in those days, but that influenced me.
Do you remember how old you were when you first really dove into club making, though, or even tinkering with your own clubs?
Well, in college, I actually have a wedge here that I ground in college. The SC team was kind of sponsored and supported by the Spalding Company, and so I have a wedge that I started doing tinkering, reducing the heel width so I could get the leading edge onto the ball. So I missed so many greens, I had to focus on the short game. So
sure. I think famously the story goes that Calamity Jane was the first reproduction that you put out there. I know you said you were always into the history of golf and collecting. Yep. What was it about Calamity Jane, though, and reproductions that drew you to that?
Well, this man, Bobby Jones, what an incredible person, incredible golfer. And so he first got the putter in 1920 from his pro, and Jimmy Maiden. They were up in New York, and I think at Inwood. And it was a match play tournament that he was in, and he lost like the first round, which is very unusual, and he was putted terribly. And so he got the putter, got a little lesson then, and he stayed with this putter, and it was a unique rye neck design, very simple putter, but it had Calamity Jane stamped on it. Mm-hmm. And he used that for those 10 years in which he won all the majors that he had won, and that his amassed that incredible career. But later on, every year, this is a raw material, so it would be polished, and it got lighter and lighter. And Spalding came in and reproduced it about 1927, and so they did about 10 of them, and that's what he finished the 3 years until 1930. And then after 30, the Spalding Company made Bobby Jones irons and woods and reproduced that putter. And they, each successive year, they would produce that, but after many years they lost interest, and that's where I said, well, there's nobody doing this, and so I wanted to replicate it as a gift item for tournaments. So I went back to the PGA show, and that was, I think, 79 or 80, and I went back to the PGA, probably 79. And the big manufacturers had kind of left their primary labor base, and to make persimmon woods you had a lot of steps, about 60 steps to make them. And you really had to have a learning curve and some really good quality people. And I didn't see that. So there was a wood maker in Long Beach, and it was called Four Star Foundry, and it was Bob and Jesse Gonzalez, and Charlie Lyons owned the foundry, and they said, well, you can make some woods. So these guys helped me, and we started.
So where did that take you from making woods to eventually making irons, making wedges?
Well, it got me into the business, true business of golf, and so I took those woods, and I had buddies that were really good, and they were out on tour, and so I showed them to them and went to the tour, and that was my training, that was my test center, is the tour. And so I listened a lot, and I came back and was refining and so forth, and in 1986, 6 years later, we were #1 at the Masters in Woods with the Darrow survey, which was great.
In between then, when did you really know that you were onto something, that you had a product?
The sale, I got salesmen calling me to, different territory, and I started, we had a business going.
Yeah.
So we had to make it. But I started with, virtually nothing. And as a matter of fact, Charlie said, you're going to fail. What are you calling this thing? What are you going to call this company? And I love the classics, and they said, well, alliteration, Cleveland Classics. So that's where it started, and then Cleveland Golf.
You mentioned some friends and some tour players. Who was really the first tour player that used your clubs or that really gave you a lot of feedback on the clubs?
Well, there were a few. There were quite a bit. Bobby Clampett was one that tried it, and he was very, very helpful. David Graham was really helpful, but a lot of them. Payne Stewart used it. There were a number of, to get to #1, you have to have quite a few people.
Yeah.
And then I started having a staff, and that staff grew and had the likes of Ben Crenshaw and many, many others. So it was fun.
That doesn't just happen, right? That doesn't just happen. There had to have been something there that they trusted. And through my research, I've seen a lot of former tour players, LPGA players, say that they felt your passion come through in your product. Where does that passion come from?
Just loving the sport and wanting to produce something that was exceptional and that was, would really work. And when I went out to the tour, started going out to the tour, the wedge world was dominated by not current product, but old product, 20-year-old product. And so I said, well, there's an opportunity. And so I made a wedge and went out there and got feedback, and that was the 485, the fourth extra generation of iron introduced in 85. And then I kept doing that, and that won some tournaments, won a couple majors, a couple US Opens.
Some big ones.
Yeah. And Payne Stewart used that particular model as well. But then I wanted a bigger model, and so we did the 588, which 3 years iteration. Now it's every year,
right.
But back in those days. But that was the real iconic design that was so impactful, I think.
Why do you think that one was so impactful, the 588? What about that club resonated with so many elite players?
Well, I think the balance, the symmetry, when you look down at the club, it had the proper, radius. It had a little bit tighter radius, heel toe radius, so you could get under the ball easy. It looked like you could do that. It had a little bit of offset. The size, the toe pad, the area doesn't have a score line, the score lines and everything, the balance and the size was very comfortable and very, eliciting confidence when you sat it down. And then the sole was wide enough, and it had enough bounce, which is really critical. And it had some relief in the heel because of the tighter radius on the trailing edge versus the leading edge, and so it became very useful.
You mentioned 3 years iterating. How do you get to that wedge? Is it just all of the past iterations combined into that feedback, or how do you get to something so iconic?
You mentioned something about people having confidence in me.
Yeah.
Well, it's because of going out to the tour a lot and getting to know these gentlemen and women, and they would give me feedback. And that was critical to making little little changes here and there, and modifying, the sole or doing something for them on the fly. Mm-hmm. But we didn't have trailers in those days, so I had to go back and forth. So I went to tour a lot.
Yeah, that one you mentioned a couple different differences between the past iterations, but you mentioned some of the other wedges that they were using, the tour pros were using prior to that. How different was the 588 from those wedges, and was it revolutionary for those guys to see that?
Well, it was another step. I don't think it was revolutionary. It was another step that they could talk to they could talk to the person, and they could have that changed, and it would be changed the next week. So we gave them service, and that's what they wanted, and they gained even more confidence that I would be giving them what they wanted.
Yeah. Do you remember a piece of feedback that you got from a player or anyone really that you thought, oh, that's it, I have to go change that, or that was a huge impact on the wedge?
Well, they all had different, some guys just let me have it. And they kept their wedges. I mean, in those days, the grooves were a little bit bigger in those days, and so they didn't have to replace them as much. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
But they all wanted little different things. Like Payne Stewart wanted a very lightweight. His wedge was C8. He wanted some speed. He really released his hands well and so forth with that, and so we had to modify somehow, get the weight down in that, and that was an interesting thing that we did.
Sure.
But they kind of liked what we gave them.
Yeah. You mentioned major tournaments won with that wedge, and you kind of alluded to it there, but was there ever a time where you looked back and thought, wow, that I'm a part of, I love golf history so much, I'm now a part of golf history?
No.
Have you ever reflected on the impact that you've made, though? You've made a big impact. At some point, did you think, man, that's my wedge that won, or my iron or wood?
Well, I was very proud of that, and that's one of the things I wanted to have a signature on that club. So the logo was a signature, and also, is strangely enough, the ferrule had 3 white rings, and so if a photographer caught a player that was, in a follow through, they usually love to have bunker shots. Mm-hmm. They could see the ball. The club was here, but you could see the ferrule, and they knew it was a Cleveland. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of fun. And you could see it a ways away.
Yeah.
And so that brought identity without advertising too much.
I mentioned passion. I can see the emotion right now coming out. Why is it emotional for you?
I love it.
What part do you love?
I love having people enjoy themselves in golf and having a tool that works for them, an instrument that works for them.
Yeah.
Also, I've gotten involved lately over the course of time and with dealing and working with a lot of the instructors, you know, the Peter Cowans and all the great, you know, Siekman and the current ones, you know, I'm a sponge. I want to learn. So, and I love to give that back when I go out and do fittings, you know, with Cleveland, and I want to, because people don't know, and amateurs especially have the wherewithal to be really good in the short game.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't take strength. All they have to do is hit it 30 or 40 yards. Most people can do that.
Mm-hmm.
That it takes technique, and there's a certain technique that really is effective, and that's what I'm espousing and learning and trying to teach people with that.
I've talked a little bit about you making an impact. Is there anybody that made an impact on you, though? Mentors or players?
Well, oh yeah. Well, David, you know, the Trevino Lee was, you know, it was really, I mean, he's such a character, and,
Mm-hmm.
and he gives back a lot, and so does, you know, Graham was really instrumental, and probably more so than any other player, probably the most qualified as far as technical skills in golf equipment. He was probably the best.
Mm-hmm.
But I listened to everybody. Some of it, you know, went by, but
Sure.
most of it sunk in.
When you look back at just the past, not the present or the future, just the past and everything that you've done, what are you most proud of?
I love the persimmon woods,
Mm-hmm.
and the team, the effort that went into that. I mentioned Bob and Jesse Gonzalez and Charlie Lyons, and there's Wayne Byrne. There's, you know, and in the polishing and the irons and the wedges, David Aguayo that is still with Cleveland, as a matter of fact, which is amazing. And people, I mean, you don't do it alone. You do it with a team, and it's fun. You build a team, you build a company.
Yeah. Cool.